Hello, folks. Episode 3 of Life in Apparel, our podcast or show where we're going to be talking about, classic men's garments, suits, and today's episode is all about the history. So we're going to go from the very beginning, which, as I mentioned last episode, we can pinpoint to the exact day when it happened. Interesting story there, which we'll get into, all the way to present day. You may have noticed I've changed since last episode. Max hasn't. It's a little bit of movie magic for you. We're recording it in the same session.
Well, I love this suit, so I will probably end up wearing it tomorrow as well.
And so this guy I'm wearing, matching Max here, it's a herringbone tweed. His isn't really tweed, but very similar. This is from the 70s, three-piece, as you can see here. So if you're interested, if you kind of know a little bit about history and kind of the history of the suit already, the 70s, you have the key features.
Well, we mentioned that in the first episode.
Yeah.
One of the key identifying features of the 70s is that
very wide lapel.
That lapel, giant lapel, and the three-piece, of course, was a very, very popular. This is a suit from probably 20, maybe even 30 years later, and you can see it's much more narrow. They settled down a bit.
Yeah. I've got flared pants you can't really see. It kind of came from, the disco kind of scene, but interesting stuff. And then I kept the shirt in the bow tie. Kind of looks like a Doctor Who kind of character here. But yeah, so Max, why don't you tell us kind of what we're going to be getting into here today, and then we'll start it off.
Well, yeah, because in last episode we tried to talk a lot about like what are the elements of a suit, and or generally speaking, what are the elements of classical menswear? We talked about coat, trouser, a shirt, a necktie, and when you start to get into the history of the suit, it becomes more contextual. You start to understand where all these things come from. For the layperson, say you're at a nice dinner at a fancy house, or you're at an art gallery, or you're looking at pictures in a history book, and you see someone, say, from the 1750s and what they're wearing. It can be hard to know what you're looking at. But with the help of this video, we're going to include a lot of pictures. I have a massive archive of pictures from pretty much every year for the last 250 years of clothing. It'll start to make more sense what you're actually seeing and how really not much has changed.
We'll even have some pictures of Max wearing some of these garments that were remade.
Oh, I hope not. We'll see.
We'll see.
But to kind of, before we get into the birth of the suit, so one of the things that we talked about too is that wearing multiple layers has been a part of men's clothing for many, many centuries, since the Middle Ages, since the end of the Roman Empire, essentially. And one of the basic elements that was always maintained from the Roman Empire was the shirt, essentially. In Latin, they called it a tunica. It was a
tunic.
Tunic. It's a white linen shirt. It was very, very long with short sleeves, and over that they wore their togas. And contrary to popular belief, Romans did in fact wear shoes and socks. But later on, you have an evolution where you have over the shirt, they'll wear an additional tunic. I believe it was called the kirtle. You would have like a leather belt, or all these different elements.
This idea of layering,
layering
clothing, and you'll see that in like contemporary, like street clothes too. You go on TikTok and you'll see layering, how to properly layer clothes. And so I guess to start off, we should talk about kind of what it was like right before the suit became a thing.
Right before the suit became a thing. So the suit kind of makes its initial debut in the late 1660s, the early 1670s. And if for any of you looking at paintings of that era, it will be almost unrecognizable to what it is today. So we're talking about the reign of King Charles II in the English Restoration, and the reign of King Louis XIV of the French, who really pioneered this new garment. Before that time, you had an ensemble that was revolved around something called the doublet. So a gentleman, when he would be getting dressed, he would have a shirt, a white linen shirt, and his stockings. And
all like really high stockings.
Very, very high, because they didn't have elastic back then, and they were actually tied to the rest of the garment. We'll put a picture here of King Charles I wearing such a garment where you will see all the ties that actually were holding up his hose, as they called it. And the doublet was a close-fitting jacket that originally served the purpose of padding the armor that was worn by knights in the High Middle Ages. And then over that, they would also wear similar to a vest, something called a jerkin. And the jerkin was usually a little bit lighter material. It wasn't as heavy as the doublet. But in any case, these were very highly structured, very, very stiff garments.
You see the kind of like the pointy little shoulder kind of pieces.
Yes.
Think Lord Farquaad from Shrek.
That's actually not a bad analogy because, and they would wear their trunk hose, which eventually became breeches, which eventually became a trouser. Very, very high-waisted, very, very different silhouette. In the early part of the 17th century, you had the 30 Years' War, the European Wars of Religion, and the doublet became a very different kind of garment. You no longer had men fighting wars wearing armor and carrying swords. It was mostly fought with muskets. And so armor became less useful. The doublet, as we'll show here, became a leather jacket of sorts with these long sleeves. Long slits cut through the sleeve to give movement, and very open. And this is where you start to see the decline of the doublet in its structure. Because at some points they would even sew channels into the garment where they would insert the baleen from whales to give it even more stiffness, to the point where you actually couldn't even bend your body wearing these. By the 1660s, things had gone very awry. The European Wars of Religion had ended, and people were feeling very liberated and very free. The Kingdom of England had been restored, and so people were wanting color. And this is a theme you'll see, we'll talk about when we get to things like the end of the Napoleonic Wars and then the end of World War I, where people tend to throw off a lot of formality and a lot of stiffness.
They'll react in a very particular way.
Right, and fashion really is kind of a reaction to the times. The doublet, the jerkin completely died out. And the doublet became a sort of very short, almost like a bolero jacket. Very, very short sleeves with all of these like ribbon loops. There's a picture right here, so you can see what we're talking about. Those ribbon loops kind of called back to the days when you had these ties that held up your hosiery. And men were even going as far that the breeches, which were not very fitted, but they did clasp around the knee.
Around the knee, yeah.
Became like these ballooning shorts almost. They kind of looked like petticoats, like the skirts that women would wear.
Think like the stereotypical like medieval like poet or
Yeah, and then they were very, very, very feminine looking. And the biggest scandal of all was that they displayed huge amounts of their shirts. So one of the things that ever since the Middle Ages, the shirt was seen as underwear, and it was not proper to show a great deal of shirt in public. People like me that are very Victorian, I still try to adhere by that. But I'm also crazy, which is why I'm doing this podcast.
You'll see last episode, I mentioned, I had to rush in the morning to get ready, and I was showing a lot of shirt. That kind of made me a little bit uncomfortable, So now I've got a waistcoat on covering.
And the longer you wear these clothes, the more you start to feel like that.
Yeah.
But this is getting to where, now, what Keller was talking about, there was all of a sudden this huge change in fashion in the 1660s, but it was actually from the ground up. So the peasantry, meanwhile, wear something completely different than any of the people you see in paintings, because all those people were nobles and had huge amounts of money to just spend on clothing, because clothing was always something that you displayed your wealth with.
And it's a difficult kind of thing to study and look back, because all the examples are aristocrats and wealthy people. Sometimes it can be harder to find examples of the more common people. But they all wore similar things, usually just with less color and less fancy, embroidery and
usually far less well fitted, because tailoring was not, of course, what it is today. The tape measure, for example, was not invented until I believe the late 1820s. So there was a whole other system, and usually tailors did not divulge the way that they made the garments.
Trade secrets.
They were always trade secrets. But it was in starting in the 1666 thereabouts.
One of the big problems with the way people dressed back then, the English actually realized, is that the French were doing it. And that was a big problem.
Right. Well, and this is another thing too. So fashion has always been very, up until recent times with globalization,
Very political.
it was very political. It was very much national, and you would have these very distinct schools of clothing. Spain, for example, even into the 1700s, their suits are very, very different. The way they even portray them in paintings is very different than, say, what the English are doing, what the French are doing, what the Germans are doing.
And so, if I may, it was actually pretty much, you can trace it back down to the day. It was October 14th, 1666. King Charles II introduced a royal decree saying, this is how my royal courts are going to dress. This is how the man ought to dress. And he introduced the waistcoat and the coat. It was on that very day, and from that day forward,
Yes.
People would wear that in the court, and that quickly spread to men all over England and then the rest of Europe.
Correct.
And do you want to share the quote?
So we're gonna. I will only be paraphrasing the quote, but to give an example of the difference. So here we have a picture from probably 1664 of what gentlemen at court were wearing, and then here we have one just a few years later, and the radical change that has occurred.
Stark.
So the doublet, like I said, for the court, really became this very skimpy, almost like lingerie. Meanwhile, the peasantry were actually going more austere with their clothing. And so it's debated whether the coat actually comes from the doublet or whether it's a completely different kind of garment, but it was very, very long. All of a sudden you have this very long, and it was to protect you from the elements, and it's actually some of the earliest ones that we've seen are made of leather, to protect people from the brush and from bramble.
It's ultimately functional, right?
Right.
There's no function. There's no purpose to protect your armor anymore because they didn't wear armor. So now there's a new function.
Right, and it was much more. It was much easier to tailor, and it was much easier to move around in than the doublet was. And then the waistcoat comes in. So in that same year, they had a visiting delegation from Persia, although some may say it was India, that came and visited first the court of Louis XIV and then the court of Charles II. And they were wearing a garment called the sherwani, which is still worn today. And the sherwani is a long, close-fitting jacket with long sleeves. And they were wearing this garment, and Charles II said, well, he was so taken by how elegant this beautiful silken embroidered garment was that he, as documented by Samuel Pepys, that is P-E-P-Y-S, Samuel Pepys, he was a diarist, he commented that on that day, it was October
14th, I believe. We'll fact check that, but I believe it's October 14th.
He said, on this day the king hath declared that the whole of the court should wear a vest, the manner of which we know not. And
it was almost foreign.
It really was. This garment I'm wearing here, be it wool with little brass buttons on it, ultimately comes from India. And it was in order to teach the nobility thrift. That was the idea. But in a lot of ways, not only was Charles II a restoration of the monarchy of England, he was restoring something that had been lost over the last few decades, which was this tri-piece, triple-piece garment. Because before we had the doublet, over that the jerkin, and of course you had your trunk hose. And he is introducing now a long coat, a waistcoat, and breeches. And breeches is spelled B-R-E-E-C-H-E-S.
Not breeches, it's
Not breeches, it's breeches.
And
this is the birth of the suit. This is where the first time
that's the day it happened.
That's the day it happened. And these early suits were very, very different. Of course, famously, the wedding suit of Charles's brother James had 112 buttons on it. What all of them did, I'll never know. I'll never see that garment in person.
We'll have pictures here, but there's buttons everywhere and frogging on a lot of different parts of the jacket.
Right, and so what you'll see in these early suits, one of the defining features is, of course, the length of the coat. Coats are very long, and the waistcoat is also very long. and it buttons the entire length.
They were actually pretty much the same garment, just one a little bit smaller and more under the other. They were
More
very
under the
similar.
other. It wasn't until a few decades later that the sleeves were lost on the waistcoat.
And the waistcoat was shortened significantly.
Gradually over time.
Comparing these two things, the original, suit and what we have today, it's almost difficult to see the similarities unless they're pointed out to you.
Right, and you have to be able to track that kind of gradual thing. So by the time we get, if we're going to fast forward to really like the 1730s, that's when we start to see things that are more familiar to us. So the waistcoat is gradually getting shorter, but also the tailoring for the suits is starting to improve because these are very new garments for the tailoring guilds.
Yeah, they had to learn that.
They had to learn that because they were, a lot of these are gentlemen who were very old and they were used to tailoring doublets. And now everyone wants this completely new garment and it required a completely new system of tailoring.
So they slowly start to get more structured.
They start to get more structured, and then they kind of start to really play with that. In the 1740s, this is where you see the first major change in silhouette. This is when, the suit is starting to be really taken as an art form. So this is an example, an example of a suit from the 1740s. And one of the things you'll notice is that it's almost ballerina-like. The skirting really, and what you see when you take apart this suit is how sweeping everything is, and it has heavily pleated and sewn
pleated in the back, and
pleated in the back.
The way these coats were constructed back then are totally different than how these are constructed now.
But not
from the pattern.
But still the pieces are there. So like a modern coat today is made. This one is in 6 pieces, but you have 2 front panels and 2 back panels. That's essentially what it,
sewn together by the tailor to cut them out and sew them into what it is.
Yeah, and essentially all those pieces are still there. But so that decade is the first time, and what you'll see is that the suit for the nobility really was a way to display opulent wealth. These textiles they used were massively expensive and
elaborate,
and they had to be. And of course, all of these things back then were made entirely by hand. There were no machines. You had a loom, but all the embroidery was done by everything. But the next major change in the suit, you have some changes in silhouette as the decades go by. It gets much slimmer, and just much more. Those giant cuffs get smaller and smaller.
More pictures, of course, showing the change, right?
But all the elements are still there: coat, waistcoat, breeches, and a cravat. Or a stock or some kind of...
The neckwear has always been present.
The neckwear is always present. Is really with the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a major event in terms of fashion, and it was a huge ideal of neoclassicism. But the other major influence on that was, of course, British tailoring. The French kind of really drove style and fashion throughout the 18th century up until the very end. And you had these trade wars where they would even ban, for example, the British banned French embroidery. And so the British started to really embrace their production of woolen cloth as opposed to silk and velvet. And they started wearing more rustic clothes in these beautiful textiles. Because we still have these suits today, and some of them are almost still wearable. Hundreds of years later, and they become a symbol of simplicity and sensibility,
and elegance,
and this sort of austere, classically trained man. Well, that directly feeds into the French Revolution, because the French Revolution is all about we're going to have a republic like Rome, and of course that flew off the rails, but. From that, you have really the end of that 18th century silhouette, because now you have something called the tailcoat. And the tailcoat is still with us today in white tie, okay? But the tailcoat was originally intended for riding horses.
That's what that slit down the middle is for, so you can go on either side of the horse and you're not going to sit on it.
It has the 2 long tails, and it's cut straight across the belly, so that you don't have bulk sitting on your lap while you're riding.
In fact, they're not even intended to be buttoned.
Right. But all of this played into this new silhouette, which was to represent the gentleman as like a Romanesque statue, emphasizing his chest, minimizing his waist, as opposed to the very triangular silhouettes of the past. And the next major thing was the death of knee breeches. The death of breeches was slow.
It started with sailors and workers around the beginning of the 1800s.
Yes, and they were people who worked. Sailors were not a highly regarded stratum of society, and they wore these things called slops, which were heavy linen trousers, essentially with very, very wide legs.
Right, yeah, very loose fitting.
Very loose fitting, so they could climb rigging. But very quickly, as the French Revolution was really kicking off, the knee breeches started to become seen as a sign of aristocracy.
Because those were the people, the sailors and workers, who were, performing the revolution.
They were the ones rioting and storming the Bastille and all these things. So the trouser becomes the new thing, but the trouser that comes out of the Napoleonic era is very different to what it is now. It was very, very, very tight fitting, skin tight, and in very flesh tone colors. You see a lot of white, cream.
They had flap fronts.
They had, yes, they didn't have a zipper. There were no zippers. They had a flap that opened down the front. Just
Think like a German lederhosen.
Yeah.
Still preserved there.
It's similar to that.
That's kind of one of the kind of preservations of breeches that are still worn traditionally.
Correct. But the biggest thing that comes out of this is no longer using tailoring as a way to display wealth. The perfection of a garment is not in the huge amount of beautiful artistry that is decorating it, which had been a massive industry in the 18th century, where they would actually pre-embroider lengths of silk to be made into a waistcoat, and then you would just buy that and take it to your tailor, and you just cut it out and sew it together.
Now it becomes much more simple, as if it's decorating the man.
Right, but it's in the perfection of the cut. And the English really lead this. There are famous figures like Beau Brummel. You'll hear his name. He is way overemphasized in the historical sense, but it's about structuring the garment and constructing it to emphasize the form of a man. And it becomes something that's used in the military, and that really sets the tone. And the tailcoat is the dominant coat for a good 20, 30 years. As time goes on, you start to get things like the frock coat, because the tailcoat doesn't really protect you from the cold, it doesn't protect you from the rain. It really was only good for riding horses. So they start to come up with new things.
And it's kind of from here on that the military aspect really starts influencing the more general, men's clothing scene in a really stark way.
Right, and you start to see things that are more familiar. By the time you get to the 1840s, you will start to see men wearing clothes that very much do look like a modern suit.
They'll be like, oh, look at that old suit.
Right, but the tailoring still wasn't quite what it is there. By the time you get to the 1880s, you'll have the tuxedo makes its debut. Its name derives from Tuxedo Park in New York, which is where you would have young aristocratic men. They would go and have these dinners, which were not in mixed company, so they didn't feel like they wanted to wear a tailcoat, but they also weren't going to wear a smoking jacket. That was seen as too informal. So they all created this new hybrid garment between a lounge suit and the tailcoat and called it the tuxedo after Tuxedo Park. It was a huge scandal. People thought, this is a total affront to tradition.
And now it's commonplace.
And other people celebrated, said finally the tailcoat is going to die out. It didn't quite, but...
In America, it's largely replaced white tie dress for the formal occasion, or the formal dress. A lot of places in Europe will still have white tie events fairly frequently. You go to Vienna, places like that. They have the Viennese Opera Ball, and you have to have a tailcoat to get in there.
Right.
But in America, it's totally normal
to wear a tuxedo. For most evening events. And so I know this is kind of broad swaths over the history, but it doesn't start to become relevant to you, the viewer, who may be interested in purchasing these sorts of garments or identifying them. You're only going to see some of this stuff in museums for the most part. But the next true major change in suiting between really the 1860s and the 1910s is the end of World War I.
Huge.
So it's huge. So you have like these major changes, right? The 30 Years War ends, the French Revolution happens, that ends, and that completely changed suits. And then World War II happens, and that really kind of completely changes suits as well. And World War I, a lot of men died, and the ones that were kind of left behind usually were younger. They were like the little brothers, and they want to express this sort of youthful kind of boyishness with their suits. It's something we talked about in episode 1 with the 2010s. And so everything is very, very slim, and it's about taking that idea of cut of the suit to a completely new level.
So you start seeing the slimmer pants.
Right.
Not so slim as we see a lot today, but much slimmer than what we have here.
What we have here, what came before, and then what would come after. And in this decade, the British, once again, are really dominating menswear. And you see also very, suits button very, very high. They have fairly wide lapels. And it's also the decade where you start to see the loss of the waistcoat. Right, because every time you have one of these cataclysms, I think people are always looking towards the future. They're wanting to modernize, lay down old things from the past, and the waistcoat, I think, was part of that. They were seeing it as an unnecessary encumbrance.
And so one thing that I think is true to an extent. Sorry about the cat meowing if you can hear him. One thing that I think is true to an extent is after these really violent world-altering events like World War I, World War II. And it happens before as well, but it's really easy to see here because we can recognize the suits more as what they are today. After World War I, people have just been killing each other for 4 years or 4?
It went on for 6.
6 years. The men come home after killing each other for half a decade, and they don't really care so much about dressing up anymore. They just want to go back to their lives, and so okay. Look, I don't need the waistcoat. I can start forgetting about that. I just want to go outside with my family, try to adjust back to life. You'll see it again after World War II. By then, the waistcoat was a little bit rare. It was seen as optional. You saw the double-breasted suits a lot, and then you wouldn't wear a waistcoat then. And after World War II ends, you would see men just out in the street in trousers and an undershirt, like a t-shirt. Right, it would be fairly common.
Right, and this is the end of an era where we think about times when people wore suits all the time. Well, that's because that was the only garment there was to wear. And then that's not necessarily a bad thing because we've talked about all the variation and everything you can have in a suit that's, or classical menswear coat and trouser, right? There's so much variation. But yeah, the 20s really kind of changed things. And then you have the Depression era. And counterintuitively, the 30s is a decade that is radically different from the 20s. And this is where you start to have a sense of decade by decade changes in fashion.
Yeah.
The world is much more connected after World War I. We have the telephone and the telegraph. We can communicate across the globe very easily.
In the 18th and 19th century, we track changes kind of by event. Once we get starting into these more recent, centuries, it's by decade.
Exactly.
20s is different from the 30s or from the 40s, and you can see it very clearly once you kind of have an eye for it.
Right.
For example, me and Max look at this suit and we said, 70s. We can look at it and confirm it, but we don't need to. This is from the 70s. Well, we have confirmed from the 70s, but this is very clearly from the 70s, and we've talked about the features, but
Right, and we're entering into a period of time where people aren't, like, fashion isn't necessarily reacting to events in history, it's reacting to itself. Because there was never a point in the 18th century where people went, I'm not going to wear big pleated coats anymore, that was stupid, I'm going to wear this like more slim cut pleated coat. I've never seen any documentation that said that that's how people thought about it. They would just take their old coats and have them slightly retailored to kind of fit what the new style was, and they were just happy to be a part of the new style. The 30s is a repudiation of the 20s. Trousers are very, very wide, and this is the birth of English drape, English drape cut. You'll hear this term thrown around a lot. So by this point, the tailoring of the suit has really reached its full pinnacle as a science, as a really architected garment.
So at the end of the 20s and beginning of the 30s is the beginning of the golden age of menswear.
Exactly.
It's there.
And we don't necessarily have to go into what English drape cut is. This is what it looks like. And it's enough to know that, for example, Keller's suit here from the 70s is not an English drape cut. The suit that I'm wearing here is close to it. When they talk about drape, it has to do with room in the chest. The 40s does follow a lot of the 30s. The 50s follows the 40s.
60s.
The 60s is where you start with a lot of. It is a repudiation of what came before, and it's not necessarily they're borrowing from the 20s, but the 60s is a decade where austerity is over, war rationing is over.
Yeah, keep in mind World War II just ended, Cold War is brewing, things like that.
But futurism, you can look at the changes in art, the changes in architecture, changes in music, not necessarily rock music, but classical music. And things are so incredibly simplified. And the 60s is going to be the first decade, if you're thrifting, where you will be able to find a good amount of garments that still exist, that are still in wearable condition. And one of the most identifiable features of the 60s is how narrow everything is.
The lapels are really, really narrow to the point where it won't even be covering, the pocket here.
Here's a picture.
Yeah,
we'll just
you see
apply
that
a picture
the colors are really simple.
Generally speaking, yeah, you'll find a few sport coats and the like that may have something going on, but it's a lot of gray. It's a lot of maybe navy blue, a lot of gray, and trousers are very high-waisted, but they are cut very, very trim.
Yeah,
and the ties are extremely thin. I've seen movies where the tie is literally that wide. It's a ribbon essentially. And this was all because of this idea of futurism. They're looking to the future, and they go, in the future, which to them would have been the 80s or 90s, we're going to be wearing foil jumpsuits. So it's about these just minimalism.
And that's an example where we kind of got it wrong.
Yes.
We generally try to avoid the 60s stuff, unless it's like an outlier and it's a beautiful piece of tailoring. But usually that sort of reduced expression and options in the fabric make a lot of the 60s suits really dull and uninteresting and not really complimenting to a man.
Well, and
that's because it wasn't reacting to events or people. It was a prediction.
It's a prediction, right? And they're also, it's the first decade where the predominant cut doesn't work for everybody. And part of this too is because the 60s is the first decade of truly mass-produced clothing, ready to wear off the rack. If you were
standard sizes,
right? If you were transported into the 40s, you may be able to find a suit at a charity shop that fit you somewhat well. But the standard procedure was that you had 2 to 3 suits in your wardrobe, and they were handmade by a tailor, usually over 60 to 80 hours of handwork being done. This changes, especially in the late 1960s, where they start introducing new techniques like fusible material, which we'll get into when we talk about the construction of the
better
jacket.
machines,
faster machines, and people are buying standard off-the-rack sizes. Why the 60s doesn't work for a lot of body types? One, the super narrow lapel. It looks terrible on people with very broad shoulders.
Just on most people.
Right, and then extremely narrow trouser legs look terrible on tall people.
And outright doesn't work for people who have more muscular legs.
Exactly, right, because the pleats are gone, for a while. You may find occasionally a 60s garment with pleats on it, but generally it's flat front. And then you have the hippie, movement of the late 60s, which matriculated up very quickly into standard menswear, and that's where you would get a suit like this one.
Right. So whereas, the 60s is kind of the first time we really see like a failure of the suit to, fully embrace, a man. The 70s was kind of like not really an overreaction, but it was a strong reaction to try to, undo that. So you get the really wide lapels to be really expressive. You get the flared pants to just put character into the suit.
And wild fabrics too, and the reason why you have those wild fabrics is because a lot of garments, this is when polyester is now being able to be easily mass produced. It's easily mass produced and it's very cheap, and they used to call it Dacron or future fabrics. And so they're able to make it in these very wild patterns, but it's a way people were feeling that the suit was stodgy. It was conformist, and it's not that they hated the suit. People wore them all the time. You watch a TV show from the 70s. Most people are at least in a sport jacket. Yeah. They had no problem wearing the clothes, but they wanted to have something that really kind of reflected.
They needed the tradition back, whereas the 60s kind of just predicted forward. Toward the very late 60s and the 70s, they said, okay, that didn't work.
And you're absolutely right, too, because one of the things you see coming back is the waistcoat becomes very, very popular again in the 70s. And the cut of the jacket itself is actually quite similar to the 1920s, with a very small cut chest, a nipped-in waist.
Longer jackets,
although the 20s didn't have as wide a lapel. But they were calling back to this really fun time in history where people were having speakeasy parties, they were drinking, it was just after the war, they were, women had completely changed their clothes, and so there was, they were wanting to do a spin on that. And you start to have fashion designers, for the first time, really kind of taking over the industry.
Ralph Lauren,
exactly
like that is around that time.
But the 70s cut doesn't work for everybody. The very wide lapels look terrible on people who are short. The flared pants look terrible on people who are more heavy set, right? And then you have the overcorrection from the 70s with the 1980s, and this is where we're starting to get decade by decade. Where the 80s is very quickly it changes.
And you kind of see, which is something we're going to talk a lot more about in probably future episodes. It's never been the same since the 60s, and that's to do with, we mentioned in episode 1, we're going to talk a lot about a disconnect between, men today and how they used to dress. That started really in the 60s because of all these things like the end of the war and, all these things happening. They were looking to the future. All these social and historical contexts kind of broke it. And the 70s tried to repair it, but it never really was the same. And it's always been kind of, it seems like recently in the last couple of decades, the 2000s, especially the 2020s, people have been kind of hopefully making a really big step toward repairing it. But
the only way you can do that is to live in the clothes. And I always would say that the 70s is the last decade where you had clothes made for men who lived in their suits still. They wore them every single day. Like this particular suit was made in England, where it was very, very common for men to wear their suits every single day. Because then you get to the 80s, and now we have really mass marketing, crazy retail, department stores where just piles and piles of clothes, and there is this complete break between wearing the suit and then what you normally wear.
The suite of clothes is no longer the clothes for a man default.
Right, and so it becomes a sort of parallel thing, and the suit kind of becomes detached from everyday life.
Detached from men in a way.
And detached from men. So the early 80s, I have a suit from the early 1980s, and it's a very practical garment. The trousers are very well cut. The flares are gone because the whole trouser just gets wider because it is much more comfortable, much more high-waisted because that's more comfortable, and you're still able to move around in the jacket quite effectively in the coat.
We'll get into that, what exactly those are, the higher arm holes,
why it would be more comfortable. But the 90s, late 80s and 90s, I think that can be summed up with one word: Armani. And
Yeah, designers are really starting to take off into department stores and
Right.
mass production sizes, 40R,
And-
42R.
right, and people aren't buying their clothes. So people like your father and your grandfather, they're not buying their clothes because they fit. They're buying them because there's a name on it, and they had a good salesman who convinced them to buy it. So Armani comes along, and it's what you classically think of: way oversized clothes, way big pants. Now you look at pictures from the 30s and 40s.
Couple decades before,
Those pants are very, very wide, and they are pleated,
but they fit.
and they're high-waisted. But and the coats are very, very big shoulders. But those suits were all made by hand for particular bodies.
Yeah, and now, by this time, the 80s and 90s, your clothes aren't made anymore. They're produced.
They're produced, and Armani, revolutionized it by having these double-breasted suits. And to be fair, I have a double-breasted suit from the 90s, and it's nothing like Armani, but totally unstructured. Oh, it's unstructured. Well, that's just marketing because this is just a way to make it cheap. Less material, less stuff.
And it really continues into the 2000s and 2010s where...
The early 2000s, but as I remember, so the early 2000s, horrible, because this is where it really starts to get...
Skinny fit and...
No. Just before skinny fit, the cut of suits was just really, really bad. It was this nasty hybrid between where skinny fit was going to be and what was in the 90s. So the pant waist dropped a lot in the early 2000s, but it kept the pleats, it kept the wideness.
Didn't make sense.
It didn't make any sense. The coats were getting shorter, but the sleeves were still real big. The coats were very unfitted.
We just kind of lost it.
Just kind of lost it. You see a lot of 3-button jackets worn badly, very cheap production. And this is where we start to get Calvin Klein. So Calvin Klein starts to take over kind of the suit era. And you have
more designers.
And that's when you debut with people like Tom Brown, the 2010s with the slim fit. And that's a play on the 60s. Which was never a style that worked for most people.
You shouldn't have done a play on the 60s in the first place.
Right. Well,
you chose the wrong one.
You chose the wrong one, and you also chose a decade where the clothes, although were now becoming largely mass-produced, were far better quality. But they're also, so it's like cheaper manufacturing, but then they're not understanding, and this was the same thing with the 90s doing this play on the 30s. They don't understand how these clothes were made, and they're trying to make them in a period of time that is now chained to mass production. So the benefit to having the really, really skinny suits was that you get to use less material, you can produce more units.
The companies like that.
They like that. It's cheaper.
And people will buy it because they're so disconnected from the ideas.
They were buying pants that were this wide at the bottom to pants that were this wide at the bottom and being charged the same price. And it was an experiment where it much like the 60s, where there's a certain element of futurism, right? Getting rid of things that are unnecessary. This is being influenced by casual workwear and the relaxing of dress codes. The tie being seen as something that was totally superfluous. Mind you, the tie has been part of the suit
from the beginning,
from the 1660s. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, now we realize the tie is...
Epiphany, we don't need it.
We don't need it, it's horribly useless. Or even if it doesn't serve a practical purpose, we're going to get rid of it. And it's just bad.
It's just bad.
And I wore these clothes mainly because that's what was available. And you're also being influenced by your dad and your grandpa who are wearing suits from the early 2000s that were in this really particularly bad quasi-transitional period. This odd kind of stage. Adolescent stage where you go, I really don't want to look like that. And so you wear this real skinny stuff. Since COVID, though, I think, COVID ruined a lot of people's lives. It cost a lot of money.
And COVID is a really interesting thing because what happened in World War I and II, where people dressed down in a way and made radical changes, you see it after COVID too. I mean, COVID it was kind of, a lot of people are just kind of starting to realize how huge that was for the world now that it's a few years after it. That's when people at my school started going to school in pajamas, including me for a while.
It was unthinkable. And like only the worst of the worst would do something like that.
And now it was happening everywhere because people just wanted to leave their house. We hadn't been able to do it for years. I was like, great, let me out of my house. I don't care. Just let me go to physical school. Let me go shopping. All these things.
It's a similar attitude to what happened.
Exactly.
Like what we've been talking about with these global cataclysms.
Because that was a global cataclysm.
But I think for some, the big difference between what's going on in the 2020s and what's happened before is social media. For one, because now I wasn't necessarily influenced by social media. I just started doing this on my own and started experimenting with lots of styles to kind of find. I kind of went through that whole 20th century journey myself within 7-8 years and figured out what actually worked. But I think a lot of them, they start to experiment by thrifting for clothes, right? And say they hit a gemstone. Like this one, right? And you all of a sudden you realize, oh wow, this is a super high quality suit, and they're not used to wearing the suits that I was used to wearing, which were fused,
slim,
cheap material, marketed as a high quality material. They're not used to that, so their first exposure to it is something if they're lucky, is something really, really high quality.
Right.
So for example, like the suit I'm wearing today, it is not a bespoke suit, but it is from Savile Row, and it's from the late 90s, the good 90s.
The good 90s.
This is a good 90s, and it is a fully canvassed suit.
We'll talk about all these terms.
We'll talk about all these terms later, but it is extremely high quality. And had this been my very first suit I ever bought. Keller, you bought it from the tailor, right?
Yeah.
For what,
this is from me to you.
From $10 is what?
$10, yeah. This one was like what, 12 when you bought it?
45.
45, right.
Had this been my very first suit, my entire suiting journey would have been different. And I would have made far fewer mistakes, and my closet would be less clogged with stuff I will never ever wear again.
And so that's one thing that we're also going to emphasize here is thrifting, how to find good suits, because a lot of people nowadays, from the 60s and then the 2000s and 2010s, the idea of a suit, both like in the perception of men and women, has been kind of tainted, right? Yeah. It doesn't mean what it used to mean, and that's what we want to go back to. We want to clean that, because these are suits. This is elegance, this is class, these are all these things, and we want to go back and reintroduce these.
And they're expressing a classiness in two different ways, which to the layperson may not seem like a huge difference, but as you continue on in the clothing journey, you'll start to see like they're very different ways.
The personalities of these suits are
very different.
Very different, even though they're a similar color. They're both herringbone.
Similar pattern.
We both have the same white cuffs, cufflinks. I've got a bow tie, but this volume was different, right?
Exactly. And I think too with the 2010s, once that slim fit had been introduced via marketing. Really, it also, because people at that point were so heavily invested in casual wear, just wearing their casual clothes, invested all the time, that they had no idea how a suit should fit. They
don't know.
So they're taking the principles of like skinny jeans and applying it to a suit.
It doesn't work,
right? Because the cuts of the 2010s are far slimmer than what they were in the 60s. Even it's like that's not how
slimmer than they were in the 20s.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I wore pants that are almost painted on. And it's like, that simply doesn't work. You can't even, if I dropped something, or if I had to tie my shoe, it was a huge ordeal.
You had to bend like that.
Right. And it's a sort of a thing where, like now in the, we were talking about the Napoleonic era, the pantaloons that they wore were very, very form-fitted. They were exactly form-fitted.
But they had give to them.
Because they were made of like a knitted cashmere. It's almost like a very tightly knit sweater.
So you could get away with that.
Because it would stretch.
And we should probably wrap this up now.
Oh, yeah. But, we could go on and on forever.
But, the point is that's really the exigence for making this show. people don't know anymore, and we want to teach you because a lot of men and women and people in general just don't know any of these things. And the companies, the people who make the suits nowadays, they don't care. They're saving money. You're still buying it. So we want to educate you and play our part in kind of helping restore these traditions. We've been filming for a long time now. I'm going to end it off with the realization that me and Max are wearing the exact same pair of shoes and same pair of socks, and I thought that was amusing. But anyway, that's been the history. We didn't do it in the most extensive depth, in the last, 2 decades, but we'll catch that up some other day. But
yes.
Again, we'll try to wrap it up. If you have questions that we didn't cover, elaboration, we didn't explain something clear enough, let us know.
And we could always even answer it as a short or a reel.
Absolutely, and I think
that would even be the preference.
I think we're going to do that. But yeah, I've been Keller.
I'm Maxwell.
That's the history of the suit. Sorry for the abrupt ending, but if you have questions, we'll address it next time.
Yeah.
On a separate thing. We've got to go buy some suits.
Goodbye, friends.
Au revoir. Merci.